Pelvic stability is another foundational piece of Pilates. So what is pelvic neutral and pelvic stability? We are focusing on trying to keep the pelvis as stable as possible as we go through the movements. So often in a Pilates class, we will start with pelvic stability exercises to warm the muscles up around our center. So you will hear people use the term powerhouse or center, and they're referring to their pelvis and engaging the stabilizing muscles around there, your transverse abdominals, your pelvic floor, your back extensors, your diaphragm, as they create a cylinder. And all these muscles, we've got our diaphragm, our pelvic floor, our transverse abdominals, and then our back extensors. And they create this cylinder and they create stability around the pelvis. So, pelvic neutral on your back. Ideally, we want neutral to be hip bones and pubic bone level. So a nice little cue is make a triangle. And with that triangle, your fingers are going to place on top of your pubic bone and your hip bones. If you take a peek, you want your triangle to be level. Now, if there is some discomfort, you're feeling strain in your back, you would just slightly tilt your triangle up towards the ceiling, and you'll often hear terms like imprint or flat back, and that's what this is referring to. There's nothing wrong with being in this position if it prevents having pain or discomfort. We don't want to be straining. So some exercises you might be able to do in neutral, and some you might need to do in imprint. Then we want to think about lightly engaging the lower abdominals. So there's two cues I like to use. You can either think about lightly pulling your stomach away from the front edge of your pants. Your pants are a little bit tight, but you don't want anyone to notice, so you're pulling your stomach in. You're not sucking in, you're not holding your breath, there's just a light muscular engagement. Another way people like to hear the cue is think of your two hip bones and think about pulling those hip bones towards each other. Again, it's a light engagement. You're not sucking in, you're lightly engaging those muscles, and you should be able to breathe comfortably. This is why I can talk while the muscles are engaged. When this happens, my back fires, my pelvic floor lightly lifts up, and then the diaphragm is just moving as I breathe. So, testing out the pelvic neutral, I'm going to do bent knee fall out. I'm concentrating on my hip bone staying nice and still. I can keep my fingers pressed into my lower abdominals to make sure that I'm staying engaged. And I'm going to rotate that knee open and then exhale as I close. I want the hips to stay steady. Inhale as the knee rotates open. Exhale as I close. So I could let that leg fall out, but then I'm not keeping the pelvis steady and I'm not keeping those muscles engaged. So it's all about stabilizing that pelvis and keeping those lower abdominals engaged, not about how big the movement is. I'm concentrating on that muscle contraction. So I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. If you're struggling keeping those hip bones nice and level, think of a heavy rock on that hip. So think of a heavy rock on the left hip as the right knee rotates open, and then exhale as you close. Inhale as you rotate open, exhale, close. We're going to do two more on those. And again, you shouldn't feel any discomfort. So if you're starting to arc into your low back, you possibly losing the stabilizing muscles, or we're straining to keep that position, and that's where you might want to slightly soften and point your triangle up towards the ceiling. Good, rest. So that's one exercise that tests your pelvic stability. Another way we can do it is keeping this position, keeping the hip bones and the pubic bone nice and level. Exhale, slowly bring one foot up to tabletop. My ribs should not pop, my back should not arc as I slowly lower that leg down to the floor. And again, I'm concentrating on maintaining this muscle engagement. Exhale as you come up. Inhale as you slowly lower. If I were to just lift and lower the leg, I could say, yeah, this is easy. But the point is to concentrate on that muscle engagement and keeping the pelvis steady. Because also when I lifted and lowered the leg, I felt the pelvis shift. So I'm not keeping that stabilization through the lower body. Same thing on the opposite side. Keep the lower abdominals lightly engaged. Concentrate on the hip bone staying nice and level, preventing the ribs from popping. Exhale as I lift the leg. Inhale as I slowly lower down. Exhale as you lift. Inhale as you lower. And 2 more of those. And I always think the distance between the hip bones and the ribs should also stay the same. Where if I'm not maintaining my pelvic stability, so for example, if I went like this, I lost that pelvic stability and the distance shortened. So I used my obliques as well as my leg muscles to lift this up, where I want to keep the pelvis nice and steady, keep the distance between the hips and the ribs the same as I lift and lower that leg. So that's pelvic neutral on your back. Then we have pelvic neutral on our stomach. So when you're on your stomach, your legs are roughly about hip width apart. Some people need a little bit of a turnout. Some people will keep their legs in parallel. The thighs, the thickness of your thighs is going to affect your positioning because you want to be able to anchor your pubic bone. So push your pubic bone into the mat. So if I relax, my back should look arched because I'm kind of hanging into my low back. My belly's relaxed into the floor. But if I think pelvic tilt, so I'm pushing the pubic bone into the mat, and then I'm again engaging my lower abdominals. So I'm thinking about lightly pulling my belly button up towards the ceiling or drawing those 2 hip bones together. And then my upper body should be relaxed. So to test the pelvic stability in this exercise, I want to maintain that. And I'm going to lift from the hip joint. So I'm going to squeeze the right glute and reach for the wall behind me. But again, keep the hips nice and steady. And then slowly lower. It's not about height. Again, it's about that muscle activation. So that's why I say reach for the wall behind you as you lift. And then slowly lower. Exhale, connect into the glute, reach from the hip, and slowly lower. 2 more. Exhale up, keep that belly button lifting up towards the ceiling so we're keeping the lower abdominals engaged. If I were to let those abs go and go for height, notice my hips moved and my back arched. So I want to maintain that position so I'm not putting pressure into the lumbar spine. Same thing on the opposite side. Connect into the glute. Think about reaching for the wall. So again, if I let it go and go for height, my back is taking a lot of pressure, which I don't want. I want to keep those abdominals on, maintain the length in my back. Reach for the wall and slowly lower. 2 more. Keep the abdominals lifted up, reach away, and slowly lower. Last one. Exhale up, inhale down. So that's pelvic stability. Oh, you got a visitor. On your back versus on your stomach, and you're concentrating on keeping your pelvis nice and steady and keeping the muscles engaged while you do it.